समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Why has the small modular reactor, or the SMR, suddenly become the talk of the town? Prime Minister Narendra Modi's latest visit to Australia has produced an outcome, among many others, of considerable strategic consequence. Arrangements have now been ironed out to enable Australian uranium exports to India. Australia holds the world's largest known uranium resources, and India has set itself the ambitious target of 100 gigawatt of nuclear power capacity by 2047, which is when we want to emerge as Viksit Bharat. The complementarities are pretty obvious. Yet, the importance of this agreement goes beyond the purchase of uranium from yet another source. It should serve as a trigger for understanding the pivotal moment in India's civil nuclear aspirations, its painstakingly built ecosystem, and our government's seriousness to deliver. India has learned the costs of energy dependence the hard way. Sanctions on oil exporting countries and more recently continued disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz have left nothing to imagination. New Delhi realizes the strategic cost of dependence on imported hydrocarbons passing through narrow maritime choke points. Part of India's response has been to diversify its suppliers. Another has been to extract greater value from its own coal reserves through encouraging private players into mining and coal gasification, which is basically converting low calorific value Indian coal into syngas that can then partly substitute for natural gas. But alongside, India is now doubling down on nuclear power, a genuine game changer in my opinion. Now, like most strategic sectors, nuclear power is shaped by supply chains geopolitics as well. For instance, who possesses uranium? Who dominates reactor technology? Who can finance and construct nuclear plants? And who wins the race for small modular reactors, or SMRs? The digital revolution has only sharpened this urgency further. Nuclear power is no longer only about electricity for homes and industries. It is increasingly about reliable, low-carbon baseload power for data centers, artificial intelligence infrastructure, and future industrialization. The IEA describes nuclear as the world's second largest source of low-emissions electricity after hydropower. There is a renewed global interest in nuclear power as countries look for energy security and decarbonization together. Before I go further, let's understand the big picture. The global nuclear landscape remains dominated by a handful of countries. The US is still by far the largest producer of nuclear electricity. France remains the most nuclear-dependent major economy, generating about 67% of its electricity from nuclear power in 2024. Russia's state-owned Rosatom continues to be a major global pioneer for reactors and uses civil nuclear cooperation as a potent foreign policy instrument. China, although a late entrant, has rapidly become one of the most important players in new reactor construction and SMR deployment, including the much talked about the ACP-100 Linglong-1 project in Hainan. India entered the nuclear age almost immediately after our independence. The Atomic Energy Commission was first set up in August 1948, and the Department of Atomic Energy followed in 1954. Under Homi J. Bhabha, India's nuclear program combines scientific ambition with a long-term strategic vision. Limited uranium resources would be used carefully, while the eventual goal would be to exploit India's abundant thorium reserves. India has the largest thorium reserves in the world. In those early years, India also benefited hugely from the US Atoms for Peace program and from Canadian assistance, including the Cyrus Research Reactor. But the boundary between peaceful nuclear technology and geopolitics was never really simplistic. India's 1974 Pokhran test, described by New Delhi as a peaceful nuclear explosion, triggered an immediate international backlash. Canada and US halted cooperation, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group was created to restrict transfer of nuclear materials and technology. India's refusal to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state effectively isolated India from much of the global nuclear market. That isolation, however, and in hindsight, also accelerated indigenization. India expanded Bhabha's three-stage nuclear program. I'll tell you about it. In the first stage, pressurized heavy water reactors use natural uranium to produce electricity and plutonium-239. In the second, fast breeder reactors use plutonium to breed more fissile material while converting thorium-232 into uranium-233. The third stage aims eventually to use India's thorium resources at scale. The prototype fast breeder reactor at Kalapakkam is therefore not just another technical milestone. It is quite central to the logic of India's nuclear strategy. India's 1998 nuclear tests again brought sanctions, yet they also eventually forced the world to recognize India's exceptional position. India separated its civilian and strategic facilities, signed the India-US Civil Nuclear Agreement, and received the Nuclear Suppliers Group waiver in 2008. This allowed India to import uranium and engage in civilian nuclear cooperation while preserving the autonomy of its strategic program and indigenous full-cycle ambitions. Before I go further, even during India's year of isolation, two relationships stood apart and they need attention. The first was Soviet Union. India and the Soviet Union signed an agreement in 1988 for reactors at Kudankulam in Tamil Nadu. Post-1991, Russia reaffirmed its commitment even after the 1998 sanctions. Kudankulam Unit 1 began commercial operation on 31st December 2014 and the second unit followed shortly. The second relationship here is France, whose position is even more distinctive. Despite being part of the Western strategic bloc, NATO, EU, etc., France continued engagement with India in defense, space, and nuclear cooperation after both 1974 and 1998 sanctions. After the NSG waiver, France became one of India's most important civil nuclear partners. The Jaitapur project in Maharashtra, 6 EPR reactors with a targeted installed capacity of 9.6 gigawatts, is designed to become the world's largest nuclear power project when completed. But despite years of ambition, construction has not begun because negotiations over cost, localization, financing, and liability have dragged on. The natural question to ask is why? And at this stage, one must understand how the liability question became the greatest roadblock for us. India's Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act of 2010 was shaped by legitimate anxieties after the Bhopal gas tragedy. But two provisions created deep uncertainty for suppliers. Section 17B allowed the operator to seek recourse against suppliers in case of defective equipment, while Section 46 raised concerns that other legal claims might remain open. Western firms such as Westinghouse, GE, and French suppliers naturally feared open-ended exposure. Russia, with state-backed Rosatom and older agreements which are predating these laws, could manage the risk differently. But private Western capital stayed away from us. Let me now tell you about some course correction that followed. Now, two course corrections began in 2025, which is very recent because this is last year. First, the Union Budget 2025-26 announced a nuclear energy mission with a target of 100 gigawatt of nuclear power capacity by 2047. Now, it also allocated 20,000 crore rupees for research and development of SMRs, which is small modular reactors, with at least 5 indigenously developed SMRs to be operationalized by 2033. The second was the much-awaited enabler, the SHANTI Bill, introduced in December 2025 and later passed by Parliament, consolidated India's nuclear legal framework and replaced the Atomic Energy Act of 1962 and the draconian Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act of 2010. And this enabled private participation under regulatory oversight. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that India has suddenly abandoned state control over strategic nuclear activities. But it does mean that the civil nuclear sector can finally begin to attract private capital, joint ventures, and foreign technology partnerships with greater legal clarity. And this is where SMRs should return to the discussion. India currently generates a very small fraction of its electricity from nuclear power. It is less than 2%. Conventional gigawatt-scale reactors require huge upfront investment, long construction timelines, and complex site-specific infrastructure. SMR, on the contrary, generally up to 300 megawatt per module, promise smaller unit size, factory fabrication, modular deployment, passive safety features, very important, and the possibility of repurposing retiring coal power sites. For India, SMRs complement its three-stage nuclear program. They can help bridge immediate power gaps, provide reliable electricity for energy-intensive industry and data centers, and create technological pathways that may eventually support alternative fuel cycles, including thorium. But they are not magic. Most SMR designs currently remain at demonstrative or early commercial stages. Their economics depends on standardization, repeat orders, and manufacturing scale. Waste management, which is a very important problem, regulation, and public acceptance will remain hard questions to be managed. India will therefore need international partnerships, not because its indigenous program has slowed, of course that's one reason, but because the scale and urgency of its ambitions require capital, technology, risk sharing, and secure fuel supplies. Russia and France remain important. The new legal framework could finally make American participation more realistic. Now, Canada has already been a partner for long-term uranium supplies, and under the new agreement, Australia could also emerge as a reliable long-term uranium supplier to India. Uranium partnerships are not peripheral to India's nuclear ambitions. They are central to operate an expanding civilian reactor fleet without counting on limited domestic uranium resources. Imported uranium can support safeguarded civilian reactors while India continues its indigenous fuel cycle work and eventually get to the point where we can utilize thorium instead of uranium. Even if India falls short of the lofty 100 gigawatt target by 2047, almost every credible progress towards more nuclear power will put us better off without doubt. A last word on the wider geopolitical moment. Much is said today about middle powers cooperating in a fragmented world. I'm sure you must have heard this phrase again and again. Civil nuclear energy, especially the SMRs, could become one area for issue-based cooperation. While the discussion on de-risking from perpetual uncertainty is repeated at every strategic discussion, finding key enablers and key mechanisms to cooperate on specific issues and not just semantics is the real way forward. India's nuclear journey is fascinating because it contains all the ingredients of a young nation's attempt to navigate a world divided between technological haves and have-nots. At heart, a story of scientific temper and innovation, it is equally a story of geopolitics, acting alternately as trigger, impediment, and catalyst. Now, this conversation is far from over. In fact, a wider discussion on nuclear power and SMRs is likely to become centerpiece of India's strategic discourse, and I'll be back to discuss that and more. Stay tuned.